Welcome to the book launch of Boats in a Storm, Law, Migration and Decolonization in South and Southeast Asia, 1942 to 1962 by Dr. Kalyani Ramnath. Dr. Kalyani Ramnath is an assistant professor of history at Columbia University, and it's a pleasure to launch this book and just the sheer scale of its ambition and the amount of work that's gone into it. Thank you for sharing it with us. Um, Joining us as discussants are Dr. Vasuki Nesiah, who's a professor of practice at New York University, where she's also faculty director of the Gallatin Global Fellowship in Human Rights. And she's also a core faculty in the Harvard Law School's Institute for Global Law and Policy, IGLP as we all know it. And our second discussant is Dr. Anam Soomro, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the Scripps Project, Race and Multilateralism, the Anatomy of a Complex Institution at Freie Universität Berlin. Thank you for joining us. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Dr. Kalyani Ramnath for her presentation about it.
Thank you very much, Praggya, for that introduction. Thank you to you and to Liz for this generous offer to share my book with an audience that I've been longing to share it with, people who do work at the intersection of international law and history. So really delighted to be here, and also for it to be part of your amazing project on law by color code, which I have had, so I've really enjoyed learning more about it and look forward to following it in the future. I also want to say thank you to Vasuki and to Anam for engaging with the book and with sort of going down the many alleyways and following the different itineraries that are laid out in the book, and for sort of reflecting on what it might mean for this particular audience. And I'm so looking forward to your comments. So what I thought I would do in about 20 minutes or so is to really just give you an overview of the book with some, I guess, dimensions of the book pulled out for the for this particular audience that might be of interest to this particular audience, and then just highlight a few of the main contributions as I see it, and then hopefully convince you, if you haven't already, that it's worth your time to read it. So I'm just going to try and share my screen, and then I'll just go through the slides. The objective of this is also just to give you a sense of the kind of materials that I'm working with in the book. Okay, so just going to share my screen. So it worked just a bit earlier, but if it doesn't, then we might have to toggle through it a little bit. And I'll just talk through it until such time as it pops up on my screen. Okay. Are you all able to see it now, or? Yes. Okay, perfect.
It's a glitch, but it's coming.
It's happening. Great. Okay.
Slowly but surely.
How's that now? Is that a full screen for everybody?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just going to, so as Praggya mentioned, the title of the book is Boats in a Storm, Law, Migration and Decolonization in South and Southeast Asia, 1942 to 1962. It was published last year, so it's been a little bit of time that I've had to reflect on it. So you'll see me sort of talking through some of those things as well. So let me just quickly get to the overview, and I'll jump back to the slide about what I think are some of the things that might be interesting to people here. So here's just a brief overview of the book. Boats in a Storm is a history of citizenship and decolonization set in South and Southeast Asia, narrated through seemingly banal encounters with the law. These encounters unravel following the wartime occupation of Burma and Malaya by Japanese forces in 1942, prompting hundreds of thousands of migrants to flee and seek refuge in India. When the war ended, little would these migrants have known how newly independent states working on legislative frameworks around citizenship and belonging would judge these displacements. So on attempting to return to homes and places of work after the war ended, entangled in cross-border legal disputes, the unspoken question posed to them appeared to be, where were you in 1942? Did you abandon your adopted home in its hour of need? So Boats in a Storm is essentially a narration of the responses to this question, as recounted through personal and familial histories, pieced together from fragmentary archives crisscrossing India, Burma, Myanmar, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and Malaya, Malaysia, Singapore, as they attempted to preserve what I call in the book the rhythms and patterns of migrant life around the Indian Ocean. So the migrant stories that feature in the book have rarely found a place in the post-war history of South and Southeast Asia, which is often marked by diplomatic and political negotiations over decolonization. Migrant laborers who fled Burma to South India during the Japanese occupation struggled to return to work when magistrates could not issue the right travel permits. And just to give you a sense of some of the characters in the book and the kind of stories that are told in the book, there are others like Abdul Qadir, a shopkeeper and trader in Ceylon, who remitted a large sum of money to his family in India before fleeing across the Park Strait, and who found himself the subject of a tax investigation in 2 countries. A similar notice from income tax authorities demanding payment sent Veerappan Chettiar, who was a partner in a money lending firm in India and Burma, into paroxysms of anxiety. He was convinced he would lose all his carefully acquired wealth. A laborer on one of Ceylon's tea plantations, Nallan Ramaswamy, was unable to remit money to support his aging parents in India without losing his legal immigration status and consequently his sole source of income. And there are others in the book as well. So in these post-war encounters with the law, displacement, and to be clear, wartime displacement, was reframed as disloyalty. So beneath the shimmering newness of solidarity between anti-colonial nationalists in South and Southeast Asia, these seemingly unimportant legal encounters featuring ordinary migrants recharted the once intertwined history of South and Southeast Asia. So let me just skip back to this slide I had on here. I've titled it An Alternative History of International Law, but one might call it by many names. But I just want to sort of highlight 3 things that I think might be interesting for us to think through. So number one is this relationship between states and international law. And here I draw on the work of Sandhya Pahuja and Yulia Slava and others. And of course, that wonderful volume that came out right when I needed it, with Vasuki, Michael Fakri, and others, about Bandung, global history and international law. And all of this to say, the book itself is heavily indebted to that sort of body of scholarship, both in terms of thinking about the relationship between self-determination, statehood, sovereignty, and international law, but also drawing on some of the methodological insights that body of scholarship provided for us, those of us that were working at the intersection of these 2 fields. So the book explicitly actually engages with the relationship between states and international law, who makes international law, and does and who are the sort of primary actors, etc., so on and so forth. The second sort of somewhat more obvious intervention in the book is the relationship between race and migration, and this sort of idea, this body of scholarship, not just in history or law, but also broadly in other fields about how race shaped mobility. And here I was sort of really influenced by, I want to say in particular, Alison Bashworth's work, where she looks at sort of decolonization as the missing moment in the history of the relationship between race and migration. So on the one hand, you have this very rich account of how race shapes migration under colonial rule, and on the other, you have plenty to sort of work with when we think about contemporary migration regimes and the role that race and racism play in that. The missing moment really is decolonization. So I think one of the ways in which the book kind of might be seen as making a contribution is to think about that moment of decolonization between the 1940s and the 1960s, where new nation states are sort of grappling with this idea of how do we regulate mobility? What are the mechanisms that we might use? What does the infrastructure look like? And the book is also about the impact that it has on the people who are trying to cross these new borders. And then the third is about scale, which Praggya mentioned right at the start, the scale at which one might write international legal history. And here, I'm also reminded of Louis Eslava's beautiful essay, Istanbul Vignettes, which I've returned to multiple times, about the everyday operation of international law. Obviously, others who have written about it as well, as also Sandhya Pahuja's essay in that volume, Letters from Bandung. And both have sort of this very remarkably rich way of thinking about the relationship between history and law, particularly at this moment, and sort of the scale at which one might write that history, not necessarily writing international history at the scale of the international, but really interrogating what that international means. And of course, here, as far as the subject of the book is concerned, it is about refugeedom and statelessness, and the very sort of well-known critique of post-war refugee regimes that certain kinds of displacements, notably that following the partition, was immediately left out of international conventions around refugees, but also that what that does to what I call other partitions in the book, and I'll say, excuse me, a little more about that in a minute. So what did those international refugee regimes look like for these other partitions in South Asia? And this idea of statelessness and citizenship, not as sort of as a sort of binary, but as 2 points on a spectrum of legal statuses and how people kind of move across them over the course of their lives. And I think so I just wanted to sort of put these themes out there as questions that we can discuss, but I'll just kind of tell you a bit more about the book, and hopefully you'll see all of those themes kind of running through it, right? So, I mean, the book itself is sort of speaking also to points of emphasis in history and international history. So, for instance, the history of decolonization and the end of empires usually focuses on the partition as far as South Asia is concerned, of course, and then talks about the emergency as far as Southeast Asia is concerned. The emergency, of course, being this event where more than 400,000 people in Malaya suspected of pro-communist sentiments were resettled, so expelled, deported, and camped by British imperial forces during the emergency. So what I claim in this book is that the stories that I tell in this book, those people did not command the same degree of attention from international institutions, neither from international institutions nor from national governments, that either the partition refugees did or the people who were resettled during the emergency. So, in a sense, the actors in this book are sort of shadowy figures, painted either as villains or victims whose lives were caught between but quickly forgotten as new nation states in South and Southeast Asia emerged victorious from the collapse of imperial rule. Legislative frameworks around citizenship reference both the partition and the emergency. but much less often the impact of the Second World War. And what I have on the screen here is just a sort of a reference to the historical background against which this narrative unfolds, which is the networks of imperial labor, capital, and trade between South and Southeast Asia from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century. During the global economic depression in the 1930s, these migratory patterns, so some accounts put it at about 28 million journeys across the Indian Ocean. It suffers sharp downturns during the economic depression, leading to fewer circular migration and greater settlements. As Japanese forces overpowered British, American, and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia during the war, borders between these colonies closed, and these migratory circuits were seen to have severed. So many of the iconic, and these are just two of them, iconic images of the Second World War in Asia are associated with the Long March out of Burma, during which thousands of people perished, having never made it back to their ancestral villages. This intertwined history of South and Southeast Asia often ends with the Japanese occupation. Scholars assume that the war ended any hopes that migrants had of retaining networks and connections across the two regions. But this interpretation privileges the perspective of British and Dutch imperial forces that returned to former colonies at the end of the war, or that of the political leadership for whom economic and military disasters during the war signaled the end of imperial supremacy. Boats in a Storm instead begins here with these other partitions following wartime displacements. And so, to borrow the literary metaphor in the title of the book, the storms in the lives of migrants was just beginning. And after the war ended, temporary displacements threatened to become permanent. Borders were suddenly juridical as much as they were geopolitical, seemingly everywhere, not only at the checkpoints and quarantine camps where land met the sea. As ethno-nationalisms that had slowly been brewing in India, Burma, Ceylon, and Malaya seized the opportunity to rid new nation states of foreigners and outsiders, wartime displacements of migrants began to have legal consequences. So you'll see, just to go back to those stories that I mentioned earlier, financiers like Veerappan Chettiar and traders like Abdul Qadir faced the prospect of double taxation that would rapidly deplete their overseas fortunes in Burma and Ceylon. Laborers like Nalan Ramaswamy struggled to explain to judges why signing off as a temporary resident on a remittance form was not at odds with their plans to permanently settle in Ceylon. So in a sense, the legal decisions in these very ordinary cases involving states and officials, how migrants paid tax, changed immigration status, avoided deportation, got married, and willed away property, began to have life-altering consequences for migrant lives that had been once lived across South and Southeast Asia. And so now I just want to shift focus to the kind of material that I've used in the book, just so you have a sense of what it might look like to write a history of the everyday operation of international law. So Boats in a Storm, so you see on the screen two images of the Madras High Court in India. This was my primary archive where I started doing my research. I was interested not necessarily in looking, and I went in, I wasn't really expecting to see all of these cross-border legal conflicts, particularly involving Southeast Asia, which many assume, after the 42 war, that there was no further connection, or that was at least the received sort of notion from historical accounts. But I started seeing all of these connections through legal conflicts. You see included sort of case files of this kind. So they are not all handwritten, like what you see on the screen here. Some were typeset as you get into the 40s and the 50s. All of this is uncatalogued, and those who are familiar with the record room of appellate courts in India will know that there is no index or catalog to go and look it up. So this involves a lot of just looking through these papers to try and find what might be useful. So I started working with these materials. And here I just want to make a sort of a brief observation on what this on law and legal archives. So law, understood not as doctrine, but as legal practice, is a new archive for decolonization, where personal and familial histories provide glimpses of lives lived beyond national boundaries and rhythms and patterns of migrant life beyond what is revealed through statistical tables of immigration and return. Through disputes over taxation, immigration, and detention, both attempts to show why decolonization in South and Southeast Asia is not only to be understood in military, political, and administrative terms, as they frequently are in the case of Sri Lanka or Malaya, nor is decolonization the triumphant final chapter in the history of revolutionary traditions, as in the case of India or Burma. So these struggles, still ongoing, are the unfinished business of the end of empires in South and Southeast Asia. And so just two main contributions that are very specifically the kind of historiographical interventions that the book makes, but we might go back, for this, the purposes of this audience, go back to some of the themes that I mentioned earlier. So very specifically, the book also tries to make a claim about citizenship not being a constitutional or legislative fact, but as emerging from these cross-border legal conflicts, that national citizenship regimes were not imposed and then practiced, but that the question of citizenship itself emerged from these conflicts as a possible solution. And then the second point I wanted to make, or the book tries to make, is about, as I mentioned, the question of, or the history of decolonization being a history of displacement, dispossession, belonging, and loyalty, even as it is about sort of cross-border solidarities as well. I want to say three quick things about the structure of the book. First, it's organized around legal regimes that migrants encounter. So taxation, immigration, and detention, rather than by place or jurisdiction or by groups of people, laborers, traders, journalists, or politicians. This is how migrants encounter the law. So imagine an ordinary person encountering the law. For them, it doesn't make any difference whether it's in income tax practice or family law practice. So I wanted that sort of to be reflected in the book. Second, the chapter titles gesture to the attention, as you will see, banana money, tax receipts, application, so on and so forth. Gesture to the attention to paperwork in the book. Paperwork is ubiquitous in the lives of immigrants, and fears around paperwork, so forgery and fraud, are equally rampant among the states that issue them. The first 2 decades following independence in South Asia were not different in this respect. And then finally, the chapters are bookended by 2 displacements from Burma to South India, one during World War II in 1942, and the other in 1962 in Burma following the military coup. So each of the chapters returns to 1942 at the start, and sort of it was meant to reflect the way in which legal practice stretched the time of decolonization for migrants who were caught in its crosswinds. So we might also have perhaps a chance to chat about legal temporalities and what that does for our histories of decolonization. Now I'll just very quickly sort of show you some of this archival material, and then I would love to hear what Vasuki and Anam have to say. And this is in chronological, so this kind of reflects the structure of the book. So initially, the book opens with a discussion of the war and the kind of people scrambling to get hold of pieces of paper that allow them to return to their homes and places of work. So on the screen here, you see, what was called a B permit, a temporary permit on the left that would allow laborers, traders to return to Burma after the war. But you couldn't get one of these unless your name figured on what was called an evacuee, a very badly managed evacuee census that was conducted in 1943. And you managed to get a hold of an evacuee identity certificate. If you got one of those, then you could get the B permit. But of course, as you can imagine, not many people were able to participate in that census. And as a result, many were sort of left stranded without access to their homes in Burma. One of the cases that I discuss in the book, which explicitly, I think, invokes international law, not only as a frame of reference, but also as a an instance where the litigants themselves invoke international law in their argument has to do with this very ordinary debt recovery case involving Chettiar traders, who are sort of trading between South India and Southeast Asia, and they're caught in the crosswinds of the war. They're stuck in many of their sort of traders are stuck in Burma, and they're forced to trade in occupation currency, which you'll see on the screen here. Sort of promulgated by the Japanese government. And once the war ends, the question is, was this occupation currency valid, or do they have to kind of return these? Carry out these transactions all over again. Of course, many of these cases are litigated not in Burma, but in Madras, in South India, because they can't return to Burma. It does bring up questions of the nature of occupation itself, what are the powers of an occupation government, so on and so forth, and so explicitly about international law. I've also written about this case elsewhere in terms of what it does for histories of international law. I mentioned double taxation, fascinating topic. Everyone should be doing histories with income tax assessment forms. I also had the chance to work with, to travel to Yangon actually. And the picture on the left is, just the remnants of money lending firms and in Burma. What they leave behind. Of course, they're not there anymore. And what the immediate aftermath of the war does to the law of partnerships, so on and so forth. I sort of investigate that as well. And the impact that the capital P partition has on the law of partnerships and how the other partition story kind of fits into it. The next set of chapters, application forms and women who wait, have to do with immigration. So I was able to look at a number of application forms, much like the one that you see on the screen here from the National Archives of Sri Lanka, that were filed by long-term residents, immigrants from India who wanted to claim Ceylonese citizenship after the war ended under the Indian and Pakistani Residents Act. Only about 10% of them eventually get Ceylonese citizenship. Many of them are laborers on Sri Lankan tea plantations without access to the kind of documentary trail that the Act demanded, and are the subject of repatriation agreements between the two countries later on. So I looked at application forms like this, about their appeals, the fears surrounding illicit immigration, and so on and so forth, to traders who were forced to kind of resort, when they were denied citizenship, to resort to what was called, as you see on the image on the left, a temporary residence permit to try and continue trading between the two places. So this is, in a sense, recall, what I said earlier about citizenship and statelessness being a spectrum. So when they were at the risk of statelessness, how they kind of resorted to legal measures like this. This was also about traders across the Park Strait. And then the final set of legal encounters that I chronicle is about cross-border legal conflicts between India and Singapore. And this had to do with the initial set of preventive detention laws that India passes after the war and after partition, and the young men who were sort of caught in it. And here I got to actually go back to some of the lawyers and the law offices actually that featured in those cases, and to have a little chat with them about what that experience was like. And they exclusively represent labor. And so that was really interesting for me to sort of work with as well in terms of material. So taxation, immigration, and detention, these are the three regimes that I look at. And of course, the book ends in 1962, or rather 1962 becomes a vantage point from which to kind of view these earlier legal encounters. And 1962 the year of the military coup in Burma, but it's also the year in which immigration laws in Britain are being reworked and reframed to make it much more restrictive, because of the sort of many waves of immigration that they see following the end of the war that they hadn't anticipated, apparently. But it also, so 1962, in a sense, it kind of becomes a really neat vantage point, sort of as that first wave of decolonization ends. And so the book kind of pauses there. And so returning to the main contributions, but I'll just maybe stop here and then see what Vasuki and Anam picked up on, and then we might have a conversation around that. So I'll just stop sharing my screen, and then thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Kalyani. I'll first go to Vasuki for her comments on the book.
Sure. Great. Thank you so much to all of you for convening it, and Kalyani for this really beautiful book. So I thought maybe what I could do is speak to what I think of as the book's contributions, thinking of it from the perspective of an international law scholar, and particularly an international law scholar invested in third world approaches to international law, to TWAIL. So I may in some sense resonate with some of the things that Kalyani has already mentioned, but I'll just draw out things. I think I had four things I wanted to emphasize. Yeah, so three insights for TWAIL, and then one finally looking for new directions as well. So this is a wonderfully rich and insightful book that speaks to the complexity of intersections between law and war, empire and imperial subjects, between property and territory, citizenship and political subjectivity. It's a movement of soldiers, of workers. In my brief comments, I want to highlight ideas especially pertinent to TWAIL scholars, who Kalyani has already mentioned, which builds on but also contributes to the work that Luis Eslava and others have been doing on the international in the everyday. So firstly, the book foregrounds sort of the paradoxical continuities between movement and stasis. The fact that people are constantly in motion, even if the legal system engages with the world as if it is in stasis, including, for instance, the construction of legal concepts such as jurisdiction and borders, sort of concepts that we all encounter all the time. This book demonstrates how those legal norms are challenged and transformed through movement, through people's multiple loyalties and social relations, and that these long histories of border crossings and the way legacies of colonialism and empire, as well as migration and war, shape who has freedom to cross, who has freedom to stay, who is seeking out mobility, who is subject to forced circulation. That these are all about those negotiations in ways that really challenge traditional approaches to those international legal concepts. So that's sort of one thing I wanted to emphasize. The second, and this also is very quite related, that it argues for understanding international legal norms operating sort of not only at sort of 30,000 miles above the ground, but in the reenactment and recharting of the relationship between macro and micro political histories. How attention to the quotidian, granular dimensions of people's lives both sort of illuminates and unravels an approach to international law as if we can no longer treat international law as if it operates and gains meanings in a geopolitical register that's sort of inaccessible to ordinary lives and struggles. And in many ways, even TWAIL work, including, I would say, Bandung that Kalyani mentioned, really speaks about international law as the domain of elites, as you know, the Sukarno and Nehru and so on. And this essentially argues for challenging and flipping that preoccupation that we have historically had, even in telling the story of post-colonial, anti-colonial work in that context. Okay, so and then a third argument is that I think the book is a very close engagement, of course, with a very particular legal history of the mid-century South and Southeast Asia, that Bandung world, and it makes a very compelling argument that understanding that history requires that we attend to the relationship between war and decolonization. And again, I think it's not something that we engage with in the context of telling the story of Bandung or telling the story of decolonization. And this book says actually the end of the war and the impact of the war, the Japanese occupations. These are all things that are absolutely essential to the decolonization story. That war so saturates, and the aftermath of war so saturates the everyday, including the everyday of empire. That in this book, the laws of citizenship and belonging perform a particular function in regulating membership in the nation, perhaps in ways that have a long reach into how post-colonial life unfolded. But the post-colonial compact in that context is negotiated in the work of those forces of displacement and disruption that emerged from the war. So that even as nationalism was seeking to create and give momentum to forces seeking national cohesion, that here the war has a very different function and forces cohesion to be negotiated through and engage with disruption and displacement. And we are used to thinking of nations and nationalism as prone to war, but here we see that war itself having a constitutive role in forging nationhood, and I think so that's quite critical and important. And then well, I said three insights or two elements. I would say I guess I would add one more before I go to the final point. That the book is, you know, at the intersection of national law and international law, and maybe this is actually a recapitulation, now that I think of it, of my second point. But the book argues, of course, very strongly for the local, but it's a revelation about the reach of local government, and including the role of judiciary of local judiciary in the negotiation of the post-colonial story. That so much of and it's a reminder also, I think, that of the last 75 years has really been one of centralization, where more and more of those functions of navigating people's relationships with the outside world is now channeled through the center, through federal institutions such as the Supreme Court or the national bureaucracy. But it needn't have been this way. And sort of this book kind of gives us a window into a moment where it was still but still local officials had a lot of engagement and a big role in dealing with, you know, passports and taxes and overseas investments and all of those things. That local institutions are willing and able and perhaps more agile in dealing with the fact that people's lives were in motion. And that lawyers may be especially interested that in the role also of professional practice, the politics of the office of ordinary judges and magistrates who are regulating movement and stasis. And that these moments of encounter between state authority and ordinary citizens highlight the performance of different functions in relation to that tension between movement and circulation that the book engages with more generally. Okay, so the final point I want to make is actually both builds on the book, but also I think speaks to how generative the book is in terms of thinking about new directions. And that is basically, I think the book is also telling us a racial capitalism story. And it's saying, and it's giving us a racial capitalism story in two registers. Firstly, it's a story of money, of taxes, of wages, of loans, of debts, that capital was always already mobile, and it's sort of you know, the capital, in some sense, the way capital circulates, of course, is an important archive for this book. And the second dimension in which it's sort of opening up a racial capitalist story is that it's actually a labor history. That this is a history of labor law, that labor law was always transnational and transnationally negotiated, that it's not just migration flows from contemporary globalization, but that there's a longer history of these kinds of movements. And I think going forward, Kalyani's work suggests that she or others building on this work can have, there's more work to do to draw from this sort of richly suggestive ground that this book lays out about the racial capitalism story in this moment of decolonization, because I think those two sort of traditions, intellectual traditions, haven't met as much in the Southeast Asia region, the way in which, for instance, there has been a little bit more engagement in the Caribbean and in other contexts. So I think that's, it's quite very productive in laying the ground for that. So okay, let me wrap up. I know I've gone over. Many thanks to Kalyani for this wonderful book, brimming with insights. It opens new archives, shapes new methodologies, raises new questions. And perhaps the last thing I want to say is it's also very beautifully written. So it was a fabulous book to read. So thank you.
Thank you. I'd now invite Anam for her comments on the book.
Okay. Hi.
And then we'll go back to Kalyani.
Okay, I have 5 to 7 minutes, you said, right? Okay. Okay, so Kalyani, thanks for the presentation and your book, which I agree with, a lot of people who read this says that really it's a beautifully written book. And it's actually so nice to see how the people who we normally consider as irrelevant to the history of international law or to history itself, right? Suddenly they take center stage, and the story that enables you to tell, right, about so many things, law, freedom of movement, the history of the state, I think that's fabulous. And so maybe that's my favorite part of the book and where I'd want to start off with. And okay, so I have maybe 3 comments that I want to discuss, but the first one is, so you raised this concept of migrant life in the book, right? And through this history you tell between 1942 and 1962, essentially what you argue, what you show us is that through these various legal regimes, like taxation, the governance of where your wife is and what that proves about your loyalties and so on to a particular state, what it ends up doing actually is cutting off or disappearing or effectively killing off a form of migrant life that existed prior to what we know as the decolonization era. And in that sense, there's something quite sad about that, which we've not really, people these days, they talk about cosmopolitanism, they talk about, the EU being this kind of paragon of what is cosmopolitanism. But I really do think that the histories of the Indian Ocean, and I think especially the historiography of mobility within the Indian Ocean region, shows this so beautifully, right? That this was and had always been an area of flux and movement and status. I mean, just again from the lived experience part of the story, when you are in Karachi, which is in Pakistan, if you're walking around in the old part of the city or near the port, you buy things like Mulbari parathas, Mulbari tea, like this part of the story of the movement still lives on, but try getting yourself to that part of the world is like virtually impossible, right? So to my mind, I think, this is a major contribution of the book. And, I'm working now on pieces that help us historicize illegal migration and all of this. And one of the things I think in the book that you show so well is that, migrant life, or like even this label migrant, it's something that becomes relevant in the decolonization era. Like, people prior to this time, they probably weren't known as migrants to begin with. It was just a way of living, right? So, I mean, that to me was my favorite part of the book. And I thought this is a concept I'm definitely going to be using going forward in my work and thinking about how we even think of this, the movement of the imperial world into the decolonized world and what that actually means for people's lives every day, right? And I think that brings me into my second point, which is, I mean, I don't know if this was something that, you were considering as like a major argument of the book, but again, for me, it really, I thought, okay, so you're using the Alison Bashford idea of decolonization as this missing link in the story of nation states, the story of movement, essentially, right? And I think your book also, so, my own background, I guess, is international law and international relations as well as history, right? And decolonization often appears to us in these disciplines as, as Vasuki said, maybe the story of war, or maybe it appears to us as, especially in IR and international law, you have the story from Hedley Bull and, okay, some work from Anthony Angie and others who have criticized it, and Adam Gitachew, who you also cite, but almost as this big bang, like decolonization happened, and then suddenly we arrive into the post-colonial world. And apparently, everything was long settled and it was simply a matter of applying some laws that existed. But that's very much not the case, right? For example, the long partition from Wazir Zamindar and, your work, these other partitions, they actually tell these juridical stories, these like that, that operate in a completely different, as you said, legal temporality. They, they are slow, they are mundane, they require a whole lot of patience, and they've not really been theorized. Whatever you want to say about theorization versus the non-theorization or everyday. But in so doing, you actually show us this like long, kind of slowly simmering process of decolonization. And also you historicize it for us. And, okay, so I would say maybe in international law or IR, you have much more a Eurocentric lens. So they'll always say, okay, 1945 is the big bang when this happened. Okay, and, already I appreciate you start with 1942, which is a, you go a little bit further. But, and there's so many, I mean, one of the, so for me, what really stands out is decolonization takes place in so many tenors, right? You can have the big end of World War, or you can have the story even of Bandung, which exists as either the story of, post-colonial solidarities against empire, which, of course, has been critiqued and said, okay, no, actually, it was also a story about, post-colonial states fighting with each other, essentially. And I think this is an interesting story. On an ideological level, one senses anti-imperialism of decolonization, but at the same time, as Vasuki says, the story of racial capitalism and how people get divided up. We love to operate with this myth that the nation state exists and its people are already a known entity, right? This is somehow foundational to international law, but this has never been a known entity. The people have to be carved out, and the principles on which people get carved out from, a general mass of population into citizens, non-citizens, and, a dizzying array of categories, temporary residents, spouse something, laborers who somehow always escape or not quite sit comfortably within the migrant category somehow. These are stories of racial capitalism, and I suppose going forward, I also would love to see how, or if you are interested in weaving this story more deeply into your archival research, which again was was so great to see how you bring together these stories. And again, so in this like historiography essentially of decolonization that you raise, you have the story of how people are carved out, how the state itself knows its subjects, or, and of course through things like passports, permits, that's the tool the state has, right, to to identify people. It's not that we come born into this world with anything particular to a state in our bodies, right? And I think in the last, maybe the conclusion or the last chapters, you raise this idea of the second wave of decolonization, right? Which is then after the 1960s, you have, for example, the imperial metropoles. So you speak about Britain, making its Commonwealth nationality laws. Around the same time, France is doing the same thing. And so the mobility of people, I think it is a fascinating aspect of the mobility history of decolonization, which is that first citizenship amongst the colonies gets divided up and broken up, and like those mobilities get fractured first. And then as people, as those old circuits of mobility get broken, people are kind of, pushed into new circuits of mobility, which then the imperial metropoles have a problem with and start, which brings us, and I think this is a really great contribution of the book, into the second phase of decolonization, which is, somehow I would say, I'm not sure if this is the third or the fourth wave of decolonization that we currently live in, but the problematization of mobilities, the mere presence or the arrival of people from certain places and not other places that, drives so much of politics and so much of, I don't know, I guess we are still in some sense decolonizing, right? And then I suppose the last, to push forward in new directions, we know very well that empire was a story about divide and rule, right? And I wonder if, the nation state system, which often gets sold as, the answer to the problems, or, this is Adam Getachew's argument, I think, that self-rule, alien rule was considered the only problem of empire, which of course we know is not the case. But I've been thinking a lot about how mobility itself is something that is so intrinsic to empire, it is so intrinsic to, to migrant life or whatever these other ways of being might be, which is that it's very much possible for people from the imperial metropole to still go to all of these places and be welcomed, but the colonized subjects who are fighting for the decolonization, they have found their lives to be much more structured and contained within particular units. And the only way, apparently, to find freedom of movement or to find, to recover maybe some sense of that migrant life that's lost is then to align yourself into citizenship regimes of, whatever the rich world, first world countries, or whatever you want to call it. And I think that that kind of mobility story of decolonization is a really, really rich undercurrent in your work. And I mean, you show it beautifully through the lives of, through all the characters in your book. And yeah, I mean, I can say a lot more about the paperwork element, which I really, really appreciated. I also know it's extremely hard to do. So really congratulations for bringing all those rich, I mean, you're saying there wasn't even a catalog. You just like were in the archives reading through things, thinking this might be relevant and that might be relevant. And in some sense, I want to say that I wish that your book was written, published 5 years earlier, because this would have been such a great piece to stand my own PhD work on, where I was told constantly by professors that these lives of like these people on these application forms and like, these laborers, like, why is it interesting? And I just think because it allows us to tell such an interesting story about the history of the state, or like these high standing concepts that, decolonization and freedom of movement, but like these are the actual working outs of it, right? And if anyone wants to see the receipts, essentially, here they are. That's the paperwork, right? And yeah, I guess the last point I would say is that your work shows so well, like you draw upon the Eslava and Pahuja article, which, shows us that the state itself is constituted, right, by actors beyond the state, by international law. And, this is not a simple story of states existing and then, its rules and regulations somehow fitting into place neatly. It's a story of co-constitution. And I think that your work does such an excellent job, actually, of showing how mobility or circulation itself is such a key part of constituting the state, right? That's one of its primary functions. And the story we have here is very much the story of wealth, money, capital, and race, actually. And so, yeah, great book, and thank you. Thank you for writing.
Thank you. We're at time, but let's take it another 10, 15 minutes if Kalyani would like to respond to all of this. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Vasuki and Anam, for these incredibly generous comments. I think you both made the book sound way better than I ever could have. And so I am truly very grateful for this engagement. Thank you for pointing out those themes and ideas that, of course, as I mentioned, written very much in the shadow of great works, but also pulling out of the morass of these stories what actually would be good ideas, themes, and concepts for others to work with. It was very much the spirit in which I wanted to write this book, is for others to be able to pick up on these ideas, so to tell their own stories. So if it's done that, I am happy. And then, for second, for your suggestions on how to take this forward, absolutely. I think that would be really wonderful to kind of think about the notion of racial capitalism, and trace even more carefully the circulations of capital, wealth, and labor in particular. Not to tell even more stories, but I do think that one of the things that would be interesting to follow in that respect are the regimes of banishment that are put in place after the war in the 40s and the 50s. It evokes, it's almost like banishment evokes a different time, but it is really just so interesting to see how Indian and Chinese migrants are the subject of banishment ordinances. And one of the ways in which I can see myself kind of working with these ideas, particularly around tax, labor, money, capital, etc., is probably using that material. So I'll be sure to kind of think through that more. I don't know if there are questions that folks wanted to ask, but otherwise I'll say one quick thing about migrant life. Because I think that's that's why I call myself a recovering lawyer in some context, but then whenever I say it, people say you haven't recovered at all, clearly, because you're still working with this material and you read these materials very much as a lawyer. I try very hard, I think, in the book to kind of bring a historian sensibility to it, right? In the sense that, one of the ways in which I think it comes through most forcefully, even for me, is in this notion of migrant life that you mentioned, Anam, which was that, once you look at all of this paper, right, and you see them use terms like international law, you see them kind of evoke precedent, have them like consulting jurists on the nature of occupation and so on and so forth. You really, there is a moment at which the historian realizes there's nothing more one can really predict about what their stakes are, what their intentions are, what their interior life is like. And I thought that was really just it was a humbling moment in the research and writing of this book, which is why I ended up using the term migrant life, even though the time that I write about, no one is really a migrant then. They're all putative minorities, right?
Yes.
And that's the regime under which they're being sort of considered in the context of international law.
Yeah.
And it's, in a sense, they're trying to push back against this notion that we are always migrants, right? And in these nation states that try to portray them, even though they are to be classified as minorities, as perpetual migrants. And yet, on this, at the same time, trying to sort of retain. So there was, people kept asking me, so why are they going to court? Why would they try to sort of engage in these fairly expensive, I would argue, legal procedures, time-consuming procedures? And I realized as a historian, the only thing I can say, is that they wanted to preserve the rhythms and patterns of migrant life. So that's why I came up with that formulation, because you realize at some point that that's all one can say about it. But I think what, your comments, both Vasuki and Anam, it gives me hope, because I think there is something more that one can say with it, right? And, from that little formulation, one can say much more about the constitution of, the significance of mobility histories to decolonization, or what happens. I love that point, Vasuki, also about the centralization, the increasing centralization, and why, why this alternative history really has to start from this local, and it's not local in terms of small, it's just a different kind of unraveling that one can trace if one goes to that scale. So, I mean, there's so much. I mean, I've been scribbling furiously as you both were speaking. So I have so much to think with here. And I thank you both for just this truly generous engagement. So if there are other questions, I can take them, or I know we are already out of time. So I'm happy to pick up these conversations over email or on one-on-one conversations as well.
Thank you so much, everyone. Unfortunately, we're out of time and won't be able to take questions. But it's been absolutely lovely hearing all of you, and thank you for all of the generous engagement and giving us so much to think about, and just unsettling notions of how we understand concepts like citizenship or migration. So thank you.